Alright, I am back with another video, and today we're doing a character build that I've wanted to do for a long time. I'm going to be building my own version of Wolverine from the X-Men. Now, I've wanted to make this build for a while, but there was no way I could get it quite the way I wanted to. Obviously, I knew I wanted him to be a barbarian, because, you know, it kind of just makes sense for Wolverine, but I didn't really have a way of getting the claws in a way that felt satisfying. I guess I could have used, like, daggers as, like, a replica for them, but honestly, I really just wanted that authentic Wolverine feel. And thanks to the new Barbarian subclasses combined mod that's just come out, that's available for both PC and console through the mod manager, we now have access to the perfect subclass to make this work. Now, I will say, this build probably went through some of the most testing that I've done for a build in a long time, because figuring out exactly how our claws work and what buffs them and what doesn't, what can be used with them and what can't, took a while. So the subclass and class combination that I've come up with is the one that I found made the greatest playstyle that fits Wolverine. Now, obviously, I've taken inspiration from the comics, a little bit of inspiration from the movies, and I've also used his Marvel Rivals moveset to inform some of my decisions as far as his gameplay is concerned, because, you know, that's kind of the hot thing right now, and it's one of my best video game references for him. But basically, the core of Wolverine is going to be there. We're going to have a ton of rapid slashing attacks using our claws, able to do a ton of damage in a single turn. We're going to be incredibly tanky with one of the highest HP scores I've ever had on a build, allowing us to be effectively immortal with our adamantine skeleton, as well as we're going to be including Wolverine's healing factor so that we never really go down. Overall, I think this build encapsulates Wolverine very, very well, so I'll be quite happy to get into it now. So, let's get into the build. First up, we are playing a dwarf today, because Wolverine is canonically quite short and is built very stocky, at least in Marvel Rivals with his model, so I thought it would be quite funny to make a dwarf today. This actually comes with a few gameplay benefits. One, dwarfs are kind of like the Canadians of the Forgotten Realms, don't fact check me on that, or ask me to expand further, as well as the fact that since we are playing a short race, well, let's just say if you have a high strength Path of the Giants Barbarian once patch 8 comes out, you might be able to do a little thing called the Fastball Special. I'll let you guys do the research on exactly what that is. But anyways, being a dwarf is going to give us a few things. We do have a slightly reduced base movement speed, but we're going to make up for that in spades. We're also going to gain Dwarven combat training, which we're not really going to use with this build. We do also get Dark Vision, as well as Dwarven Resilience, giving us advantage on saving throws against poison and have resistance to poison damage. So we got a nice little resistance thrown in there for us, which I think makes sense for Wolverine anyway, to be resistant to poison, so I'm quite happy to have that here. And we're going to be playing a gold dwarf today, giving us an extra hit point for every level, giving us an additional 12 HP by the time this build is done, because it's 1 for every level, which is just a nice little bit of extra HP. I mean, 12 is better than 0. We're going to be kicking things off as a barbarian today, so we can get our rage right away, allowing us to deal 2 extra damage with melee and improvised weapons and throwing. We're also going to gain resistance to physical damage. I mean, that just makes sense for Wolverine. He is the X-Men's berserker, the one who will go in, take a ton of damage, deal a ton of damage, and basically cannot die unless you're watching the Logan movie. And some comics, but, you know, mostly can't die. Moving on to our ability scores. Pretty standard barbarian spread here, with the exception of one thing. Now, I will just get this out of the way now. Constitution is at 8, because by the end of this build, I highly recommend you use the Amulet of Greater Health to get 23 Constitution. Not only is this going to give you a massive HP pool, it's also going to give you a large amount of unarmored defense with Barbarian, and it just feels like a really natural fit for this build. However, this build does not need the Amulet of Greater Health. You can easily start off the game with 16 Constitution. If I just pop that in here, 1 second, like this, and you're pretty much good to go. Just take that 10 out of Charisma and put it into Wisdom. Basically, this is what your starting stats should look like, and honestly, you can play the entire game with these stats. The only thing it'll affect with the build is you'll have a little bit less HP, a little bit less armor class, and you won't have as much damage output. But if you get the Amulet of Greater Health and you're not going to use it on any other character, pop it on this one and gain just better defenses, better tankiness, and more offensive output because we're able to put our wisdom up. That probably spoils exactly where this build is going, but who am I kidding? You've already looked at the description. But anyways, so this is kind of what you want your starting stats to look like. We want our strength at 17 because we are going to be bumping this up with a half feat later. Dexterity is at 14, a nice middle ground. It's the least, I didn't really want to put any less in. This is kind of like the minimum I'd want to put into this build, but it absolutely does the job. Constitution is at 8. Again, this is actually going to be a 23 by the time this build is done, but you know you could put a 16 in this to start. Intelligence is at 8. Wolverine isn't the brightest, but he also isn't dumb. We just don't need intelligence. Wisdom is at 16 because this is going to affect some of our offensive output later. You can probably already guess where I'm going with this. And Charisma is at 10, so we can make those Barbarian intimidation checks at least sometimes because they are funny. Moving on, I decided to go with the Outlander background because Wolverine is Canadian. That's going to give us access to Athletics and Survival, which do feel on point for the character, as well as we're going to gain access to Perception and Intimidation with our Barbarian skill proficiencies. So yeah, overall, pretty solid kit for Wolverine at level 1. Just remember to swap those stats around so that you have that 16 in Constitution and that 10 in Wisdom. Moving on to Barbarian level 2, we're going to get Reckless Attack and Danger Sense. Reckless Attack is going to allow us to gain advantage on attack rolls using Strength until the end of our turn, but our enemies also have advantage to hit us. This never really came up in my testing for this build, but it's nice to have in a pinch. Danger Sense is the better ability though for us here, because we have advantage on dex saving throws against traps, spells, and services, meaning that we're much less likely to take high amounts of damage from something like Fireball, which is very, very nice. And finally, at level 3, we get to choose our subclass, which allows us to choose from one of the many new subclasses that we have. And today we're going to be going with Beast Barbarian. I mean, it just makes sense. Beast Barbarian is going to augment our rage, giving us the ability to choose one of 3 different rage states whenever we rage. One gives us a bite attack, one gives us a tail attack, and another gives us claw attacks. The claws are going to deal 1d6 damage plus our strength modifier plus our rage bonus. So overall, it's a 1d6 plus 7. Now, there's not many ways in the game to actually increase this because it's kind of weird. They are considered weapons because that's how they are written in tabletop, and the mod aims to be as accurate to tabletop as possible, so they're not considered unarmed strikes, so they're not going to get boosted by like monk or something like that, or maybe the unarmed fighting style. They are considered weapons. However, they're not considered weapons that are equipped, so things like the Battlemaster maneuvers will not work. You have to, if you want to boost up the beast claws or any of the beast kind of weapons, let's call them in quotations, you need to use equipment that'll boost weapon attacks but doesn't require a weapon to be equipped, which sounds weird, but trust me, it makes sense, and you'll see as we go through the build. The beast obviously makes perfect sense. We get to grow 2 claws that we're allowed to attack with, and in addition to this, the claws themselves have an extra fun little feature built in which we get a free extra attack that doesn't use our normal extra attack. So with this build, you'll be able to attack 3 times with your action. So that's 3d6 plus 7 for each hit. That's a lot of damage, and we'll be able to boost that even further as time goes on. But of course, we have many other Barbarian subclasses here that are new, so let me know which one you would like to see next. I've already done a Zealot build, but let me know from the others what you might like. Moving on to level 4 of Barbarian, we're going to gain access to our first feat, and well, we're gonna go with Tavern Brawler. Now, I know, I just said that the claw attacks are not actually unarmed attacks, but spoiler alert, we're using unarmed attacks in this build as well, and Tavern Brawler makes a lot of sense because it's also going to work for throwing things, and in my opinion that kind of does make sense for Wolverine. I mean, unfortunately, because we're not really going to hit, like, we're not going to get, like, potions of Hill Giant Strength, we're not really going to be able to throw people so much, but small creatures and such like that, we could basically kidnap by throwing them across the battlefield, then jumping to them and then ripping them to shreds, a bit like Wolverine's Marvel Rivals ability. If you do use potions of Hill Giant Strength on this build, though, I mean, obviously you can adjust the stats to your liking, as well as be able to chuck things with tremendous force. But otherwise, we can also throw objects as well if we want. It just gives us a little bit more versatility to be able to use when we want to, but it's mainly here to bump up our unarmed strikes that we'll be getting later. Moving on to Barbarian level 5, we're going to get extra attack, meaning now we can make 3 attacks with our action. We also gain fast movement, giving us a 3-meter movement buff as long as we're not wearing heavy armor, which brings us back up to just above a normal racial speed. We go from 7.5 to about 10.5, which is slightly higher than normal. Either way, we're going to get more movement speed, trust. And finally now, at level 6 of Barbarian, we're going to get another Rage Charge, which is always good, as well as Bestial Soul. This has two abilities. One, it allows you to choose a once per short rest buff that can either increase your jump distance, give you the ability to move over difficult terrain as if it's nothing, and also not slip on grease or other surfaces. You get to kind of choose one of those buffs each short rest. Also, it makes it so that our Beast Claw attacks overcome resistance to physical damage that's non-magical. So basically, Steel Watchers and such won't be able to resist our claw attacks. Now, initially, I went for a 4-8 split on our multiclassing so that we get an extra feat. But when I realized how much resistance can actually really cripple the claws aspect of this build, which in my opinion is the most important, I decided to go for the 6-6 split instead. So let's talk about the multiclass. The multiclass for this build is going to be into Monk. Surprise, surprise. Now, of course, if you weren't building this with mods, you probably would have built a Barbarian Monk anyway. But since I actually wanted our unarmed strikes in quotations to do slashing damage, I waited for Beast to come out. But the thing is, though, is that Monk just gives us so much that I think makes sense for the build. It's going to give us enhanced movement speed and jumping ability, which, in my opinion, makes sense for Wolverine. It's going to give us the ability to use Flurry of Blows as a bonus action, meaning that when this build is at full power, you'll be able to make a lot of attacks in a turn, as well as it does give us a bit of damage variety. We have bludgeoning and slashing now, which will feel pretty good when it comes up, as well as the fact that just a lot of abilities are going to synergize with our Barbarian stuff, so in the end it did kind of make sense. I did test out a few other things though, and I'll go over what kind of worked and what didn't. First up, Fighter. Obviously, Battlemaster Fighter does not work. Unfortunately, you can't use the maneuvers. Champion would work if you wanted to go for crit fishing with the amount of attacks that we have, as well as Eldritch Knight. That doesn't really work. And I did try some of the modded ones as well from the fighter subclass mods. I tried the Brute subclass because the Brute is supposed to add 1d4 to all of your weapon attacks, but unfortunately didn't work with the claws. I don't know if that's something the mod creator would be willing to fix. I don't know. But either way, just thought I'd throw that out there. What does work, though, if you wanted to go for a Ranger, if you think that makes sense for Wolverine, is that the Colossus Slayer feature from Hunter does work with the claws, so that could work for you. My main things that I tested were Fighter and Ranger just to see what worked with the claws, but in the end, Monk just still felt like the most right version of the build, I guess you could say. I'm not really sure how to put it into words, but when I played all of these different variations, I played versions with Fighter where Action Surge did feel very good. In fact, if you don't care about the Monk stuff as much, you could definitely drop a couple of Monk levels to level 4 and then go for 2 levels of Fighter for Action Surge if you wanted, and a fighting style as well. You could pick up something like what would you call it? What was it again? Mariner. Yeah, because if you have the unarmed fighting, if you have the fighting style expanded mod, again available on all platforms, and I highly recommend, you could get Mariner, which would give you a bit more movement speed and some more armor class. But overall, I think Monk does work the best as a 6-6 split, and you'll see why as we get further into the build. Sorry for the tangent there, I just wanted to go over my thought process. But yes, we are going to get Flurry of Blows as well as Unarmored Defense, but we're not going to use the Wisdom version because obviously our Constitution is going to be higher. And we are going to get the ability to use our Unarmed Strikes with a bit more power, and we also get the bonus attack Unarmed Strike as well. Unfortunately, the claws don't count as Monk weapons, so we're not actually going to be able to use that bonus Unarmed Strike very often. However, it may come up in some certain circumstances. At Monk level 2, we're going to get some important features, namely more movement speed, as well as the ability to use Step of the Wind, Dash, Disengage, and Patient Defense. Patient Defense is always great for tanky builds, but Step of the Wind Dash is going to be very important, and you'll see why later. Moving on to our subclass, we are going to be going with Way of the Open Hand. It makes the most sense for Wolverine. It's going to give us the way to augment our Flurry of Blows, giving us Push, Stagger, and Topple, various different effects, being able to knock enemies prone, stagger them, which can be very, very dangerous, as well as pushing enemies away. Overall, I'm just flavoring this as more of like a flurry of claw swipes. We do our 3 attacks with our main action, and then do 2 more attacks with our bonus action, and eventually when we get Wholeness of Body from Open Hand Monk, that's going to be 4 attacks with a bonus action, so you're just making way too many attacks in a turn while still being, like I said, basically immortal. At Monk level 4, we're going to get Slow Fall, giving us resistance to falling damage, as well as another feat. Now, at this point, you've got a lot of options available to you. You could bump up your strength to 20, or if you use the equipment that I suggest, that'll already be at 20 because we have a stat boosting equipment, as well as you could use the Potion of Everlasting Vigor to do that as well, so I'm not too worried about that here. You could bump up your Wisdom or your Dexterity for more armor class, Wisdom for more offensive power with our monk stuff, but we do have quite a few good options for feats on this build, and one feat I'm going to choose is Savage Attacker. Savage Attacker, because we're making 3 weapon attacks with our action, Savage Attacker does actually work with this, allowing us to re-roll our damage, making sure that we have super high damage at all times. So I definitely recommend Savage Attacker for this one. I do think it is one of the better feats you could take, so I highly recommend it. At level 5 of Monk, we're going to gain access to extra attack, which unfortunately does not stack in this case, but it's going to kind of feel like it does, because again, we get 3 attacks as with our action no matter what, but, you know, it is kind of pointless. However, what isn't pointless is Stunning Strike, which we can use with our unarmed strikes, allowing us to potentially stun targets, which will leave them completely immobile. So, you know, we've got a lot of ways of dealing with enemies. We can knock them down, we can stun them, we can shred them. We've got a lot of cool things that we can do. And finally, at Monk level 6, we're going to get some pretty important stuff to cap off the build. Similar to how we went to level 6 of Barbarian for this, we also went to level 6 of Monk to make sure we got key empowered strikes to overcome resistance and immunity to non-magical damage with our unarmed strikes. We're also going to gain increased unarmored movement, giving us even more movement speed, which again, feels very on point. We're also going to get the subclass feature Manifestations of Body, Mind, and Soul, allowing us to imbue our unarmed strikes with different damage types. I went with Necrotic because it ultimately does synergize with our equipment, so I think that makes the most sense here. And we're also going to get Wholeness of Body, allowing us to activate Wolverine's healing factor to give us a few buffs. We're going to get a little bit of healing, as well as restoring half of our key points immediately, as this build is a bit resource intensive on the key points, so this makes sense to have, as well as you can enter a temporary state of wholeness, where you regain key points for 3 turns, as well as have an extra bonus action for 3 turns. This is going to open up opportunities for us quite a lot. So yeah, I think overall this makes sense as a final capstone for Wolverine. And that is the build. Overall, what you're going to be getting out of this is a ton of damage. With Savage Attacker, you're going to be constantly re-rolling those damage die, giving you just a ton of damage output with your bestial claws. And because you're going to be doing so much damage with your flurry of blows, you're just going to feel like you're ultra powered at all times. You're going to feel absolutely invincible as well. We have a solid 161 HP here at our max level with the Amulet of Greater Health. However, if you did want to take the tough feat as well, this ends up falling in the 185 range, I believe. I did use tough for some of my testing, but in the end I thought it was a bit overkill, so I went for a Savage Attacker instead in the final build. But you can choose tough if you want to really get that high HP count. I believe I used it in the combat footage that'll be showcased. But yeah, overall you just have a ton of damage with a ton of attacks per turn. You've got a healing factor as well built in. You've got the ability to, you know, give yourself various different buffs, which are all very fun. In fact, I can show those off very quickly. So yeah, you see you have the ability to increase your movement speed while on water surfaces, dash through difficult terrain without slowing down, and increase the distance you can jump. That's probably the one I would use, is the final one. But yeah, no, you just have so many options available to you. You're incredibly tanky, you're incredibly strong, you just got everything available to you. One also fun final note I'll throw into this build that is actually a bug that the mod developer does need to fix. Some Dragonoff, I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly. This version of Rage still lets you cast spells. Just throwing that out there. Yeah, for some reason spell casting isn't blocked with this version of Rage. Obviously an oversight that needs to be fixed. But I did try out a little bit of a combat test where while raging I cast Haste, which I'll get into in a minute, and it got very stupid very quick. So if you don't care about balance, that is a thing that you can do if you so desire. But anyways, moving on to the equipment, as this is where it gets a bit more technical. So obviously we're not using any weapons with this build, we will be using the claws. Otherwise you can use unarmed strikes, which will deal a decent chunk of damage, but you mainly want to use the claws, which will be a significant source of damage in the long run. But for our ranged weapon, I did go with the Darkfire Shortbow, which is completely optional, but I did like the idea of having resistance to 2 combat common damage types in order to make us feel like we're even more tanky than normal. Otherwise, completely drop this one. It's not necessary for the build. I just thought, hey, I'll include it as a fun little thing to be able to get some more, damage resistances. And it does give us cold damage resistance, and Wolverine is Canadian, so I think that makes sense. And I'm allowed to make these jokes because I am Canadian. Well, technically, I lived in Canada for 11 years. I think that counts. But anyways, moving on to our equipment. For my head equipment, we have the Scabby Pugilist Circlet. Your weapon and unarmed strikes deal an additional 2 damage while surrounded by 2 or more foes. So basically, if you jump straight into the thick of combat and are surrounded by all the melee combatants, both our claw attacks and our unarmed strikes are going to deal an additional 2 damage. That stacks up when you're making upwards of 5 or 6 attacks in a turn. That is a lot of extra damage, and again, it's one of the very few pieces of equipment that boosts weapon damage without actually requiring a weapon to be equipped. So it made sense for this build since it boosts both things. But that is the late game option. The early game option is the Haste Helm to give you more momentum for 3 turns. This is just going to help you kind of compensate for your slower dwarven speed with your stubby little legs as you are in the early game before you start getting the real movement options. Moving on, the Cloak of Protection just gives us a +1 bonus to our armor class and saving throws. We mainly just wanted to give us a bit more armor class, as 19 is pretty middling. We are going to be taking a lot of attacks for very little damage because we have such high HP and resistances. However, I did still want to have at least decent armor class, and the Cloak of Protection does help with that. Moving on to our armor, we have the Mighty Cloth, I should say. You're going to gain Bull's Strength, giving you advantage on strength checks, and your carrying capacity is doubled. That's just kind of a fun little bonus effect. The main thing that we're here for is that we get our strength score increased by 2, giving us 20 without the need for any additional ability score improvements. Not to mention, though, we're also going to have it so that we cannot be pushed against our will, and we have advantage on saving throws against being restrained. That made a ton of sense for Wolverine, in my opinion, just getting stuck in, gritting your teeth, and saying, no, you move, and then, ripping them in half, because you're Wolverine. I don't know, I feel like it just made sense. Also, having advantage on saving throws against being restrained, I immediately think of things like Ensnaring Strike, and then just, clawing your way out of it. I think that just makes sense for the character. We're also going to gain access to Bull Rush, allowing you to dash forward, knocking enemies prone, and possibly also knocking them back as well, dealing a little bit of damage. Again, this also felt like an ability that made sense for Wolverine, just charging in, knocking people down, and then ripping them to shreds. Look, there's a lot of ripping people to shreds in this one, okay? This video is not made for children. There you go, YouTube. Moving on to my glove choice, we have the Hell Dust Gloves. Yeah, this is a pretty bog standard endgame choice, but it does make sense for this build, as our weapon attacks are going to deal an additional 1d6 fire damage, meaning our claws are stronger, and our unarmed strikes are going to deal an additional 1d6 necrotic damage, and possibly inflict bleeding. Now see, that's quite cool because that almost makes it so that our monk attacks are kind of using our claws as well, allowing our unarmed strikes to deal to potentially inflict bleed, dealing slashing damage over time, about 2 per turn, for each turn of the condition remaining. You're going to have a lot of extra damage coming in from both sides, both your claws and your unarmed strikes, and it does just make your unarmed strikes feel a bit more like you're actually using your claws, because they inflict bleeding. I felt like I couldn't not include this here. Yeah, okay, maybe necrotic and fire damage isn't exactly on theme for Wolverine, but hey, we're in D&D world, not Marvel world, we can make up our own rules. And for your earlier game option, you can just pick up the Flawed Hell Dust Gloves, which is basically the same thing, just with a slightly lower damage die. Moving on to the boots, yes, we've got the Linebreaker boots again. I know I use these way too much, but believe it or not, Wrath is another damage boost for the claws, and of course this stacks up to +7, meaning that you can gain a +14 on your damage buff to your claws before any other items are factored. Obviously, that's pretty strong when you make 3 attacks with an action. Again, this is all from tabletop. This isn't some overpowered modded class. This was made by wizards and has just been adapted for this game, and when you add magic items into the mix, much like regular D&D, it gets a bit stupid. Now obviously once per turn when you dash you gain Wrath for 2 turns, this item is still bugged, you gain 3 turns, and the once per turn restriction is not there, so doing a double dash with your Wholeness of Body bonus actions, that's a +6 stack immediately. I expect this to be fixed in patch 8 because it is kind of busted, but even so, being able to just dash once and gain a +2 to all 3 of our weapon attacks is still going to be pretty good, but you can swap this out for something else if you like. It's not essential to the build, it is a bit overkill on the damage, but hey, we like overkill here, so take advantage of it while you can. Still good even if it gets patched to be what it's intended to be, and you can swap it out if you like. Moving on to the amulets, of course, we have the Amulet of Greater Health, setting our Constitution to 23 and giving us advantage on those saving throws. Again, here just to basically round out the build and make it even stronger to make Wolverine feel as immortal as he should. Speaking of immortal Wolverine, we get his healing factor through the Ring of Regeneration, restoring 1d4 hit points every turn. I will say, if you aren't going to use the Amulet of Greater Health in this build, swap it out for the Periaptive Wound Closure to guarantee you get 4 HP healed for every turn from the ring, and then just keep your stats at the starting stats. Or for the early game, use the Moondrop Pendant, allowing you to, whenever you have 50% or less HP, which will happen a lot as a Barbarian, you don't provoke opportunity attacks when you move, so you get a bit more freedom with your kind of monk speed. But otherwise, just use the Amulet of Greater Health. It makes the build so much more fun. And finally, really leaning into that immortal Wolverine thing, we have After Death Do Us Part. Whenever you're downed, your healing factor goes into overdrive, immediately healing you for half of your hit points, but because you've gone into such a berserker rage as a result, you're gripped by Shadow Possession, meaning that you're going to attack anyone and everyone around you, and also deal an additional 1d4 necrotic damage with weapon attacks. You know, there's kind of a necrotic theme here. Maybe there's some way to work the D&D lore into Wolverine's creation. Maybe instead of an adamantine skeleton, he's got a lich skeleton in there, and it's like his bone claws come out. Giving Wolverine the Hand of Vecna would be a hell of a thing. You know what? That's actually a cool idea. Anyways, overall that is the build. I'll quickly talk about the cosmetic stuff. First up, we've got the Fear Tailor 6 Camp Clothing from Fear Tailor's Camp Clothing mod, as well as the leather boots, and they are coloured in the P4 dye mod, which is available on all platforms, the Gold and Shadow variant, giving us yellow and black. This is about as close to Wolverine's colour scheme as I could get, and I feel like for making a Wolverine in Baldur's Gate 3, I didn't do too bad. I even used like one of the popular hair mods on the mod manager that I'm forgetting the name of, to give these little hair extensions that kind of look like Wolverine's little hair spikes. I don't know. I think this build is just kind of goofy anyway, so I just played a little bit with the design. I mean, I made him a dwarf for crying out loud, but it feels right, goddammit. But yeah, overall that is the build. And honestly, this one was tricky. Like, coming up with something that truly satisfied me took a long time. It took a lot of experimentation and figuring out what worked with the claws and what didn't. At one point, I even just considered going pure Barbarian and just kind of rolling with that and see where we went, but the later features didn't really speak to me, and overall the monk levels just added so much to this build in terms of being able to, you know, maneuver around the battlefield really quickly, jump around like a crazy person, throw things, punch things, shred things, we could deal bleeding. You know, I just feel like it all worked out in the end for a more accurate Wolverine build, even if obviously he's not necessarily a monk. But I'm pretty sure there was a thing, if it was either in the movies or the comics, where like he trained in Japan and like learned a bunch of martial arts or something. Correct me if I'm wrong on that one, I could be entirely wrong. But overall, I really like this one. I think this build is fun. I think as far as like just raw gameplay, it's quite simple to play, but you're gonna feel like Wolverine. You're gonna jump in, absolutely destroy people, and then shake off whatever damage is dealt back to you in return, and then get straight back to it. It just feels right. And again, there's a little bit of room to play around with here. Again, I went with the Savage Attacker feat, but Tough also does work, so feel free to play around with that. But yeah, you know what? That is going to do it for me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.